All right, let's go. Number 10. The megalodon. Between 23 and 3.6 million years ago, during the long, warm stretch of the Miocene and into the Pliocene, the oceans of Earth were ruled by a predator so large that the modern imagination cannot quite hold it. Otodus megalodon was not a shark in any sense a swimmer today would recognize. It was a torpedo-shaped, slate-gray apex weapon stretching 50 to 60 feet from snout to tail, propelled by a body engineered across millions of years of refinement into a single function: to hunt anything that lived in salt water. The teeth alone tell the story. Up to 7 inches long, triangular, serrated like worked stone blades. Fossilized examples turn up in riverbeds and coastal sediments across 6 continents, polished by time, but still capable of drawing blood from a careless hand. They wash up on beaches in South Carolina. They are dredged from phosphate mines in Morocco. They sit in display cases in natural history museums where children press their palms against the glass and cannot quite believe the scale of the mouth that once held them. That mouth was wide enough to swallow a small car. The scientific consensus on Megalodon's fate is settled. Cooling oceans during the late Pliocene contracted the warm, shallow seas where Megalodon hunted whales and large pinnipeds. The rise of the great white shark, smaller and faster and more efficient in cooler water, introduced competition for the same prey base. Food sources declined. Nursery grounds shrank. By approximately 3.6 million years ago, the largest predatory shark in the history of the planet had vanished from the fossil record. Extinct. Closed case. A line drawn under one of evolution's most extreme experiments. But here's where the conventional explanation begins to feel thin. Only about 5% of the deep ocean has been mapped in any meaningful detail. The figure is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a literal description of the limits of human knowledge regarding the largest habitat on Earth. Beneath the photic zone, beyond the reach of submersibles and sonar arrays, exists a volume of water so vast that the entire surface world, every continent, every city, every human being who has ever lived, occupies a thin film by comparison. The Mariana Trench plunges nearly 7 miles below the surface. The Puerto Rico Trench, the Tonga Trench, the Kermadec Trench, abyssal corridors that have never been systematically surveyed, descend into pressures and darkness that no ecosystem study has ever fully cataloged. Cryptozoologists have pointed to this gap for decades. The argument is not that a breeding population of 60-foot sharks is patrolling coastal waters undetected. The argument is narrower and more difficult to dismiss. A small, deep-dwelling remnant population, adapted over millions of years to cold abyssal hunting, would leave almost no evidence accessible to surface observation. Megalodon's cartilaginous skeleton does not fossilize well. Its prey at such depths would consist of large squid and deep-water cetaceans whose carcasses rarely surface. A creature that lived its entire life below 3,000 meters could exist for 10,000 generations without producing a single confirmed sighting. And occasionally, something does surface. Massive, unidentified carcasses wash ashore on remote beaches with a regularity that the scientific community processes through routine explanations. Decomposed basking sharks. Whale falls in advanced states of collapse. Most of the time, the explanations hold. Sometimes they do not. Photographs circulate. Measurements are taken. The remains are gone before tissue samples can be properly analyzed, dragged back into the tide, or buried by storm surge before any institution arrives to look. The mainstream position remains unchanged. Megalodon is extinct. The cooling oceans of the late Pliocene closed the door on its world, and the door has stayed closed for 3.6 million years. But the door is at the bottom of an ocean we have not seen. Somewhere beneath the surface that satellites map and shipping lanes cross, in the unlit volume that constitutes most of this planet's living space, the question stays open. Not because the evidence demands it, because the absence of evidence cannot, by the geometry of what we have not yet looked at, be made to mean anything else. Number 9. The dodo. In 1681, the last confirmed sighting of a living dodo was recorded on the island of Mauritius. Less than a century after European sailors first set foot on the island, a bird that had thrived there for millions of years was simply gone. Raphis cucullatus had no defenses against the humans who arrived on Dutch ships, no instinct to flee from the dogs, pigs, rats, and macaques those ships unloaded onto its shores. The dodo had evolved on an island with no large predators. It did not know what a predator was. Within decades of contact, it was annihilated. The bird itself was unmistakable. Standing roughly 3 feet tall and weighing up to 50 pounds, the dodo was a stocky, flightless pigeon, relative with grayish plumage, tiny vestigial wings incapable of lifting its bulk, and a large hooked beak that sailors described as both comical and formidable. A tuft of curly feathers sat where a proper tail should have been. Contemporary accounts describe a deep, 2-note call, the sound that some scholars believe gave the bird its name. Dodo, a creature so trusting it would walk directly toward armed men. A creature so unprepared for the world humanity brought to its shores that it became, almost overnight, the global shorthand for total extinction. Dead as a dodo. The phrase entered the English language because no one doubted the verdict. But here's where the standard explanation begins to fracture. Mauritius is not a small island in the colloquial sense, and large portions of its interior remain genuinely difficult terrain. The Black River Gorges, the highland forests in the southwest, the dense vegetation choking the volcanic ridges. These are regions where official wildlife surveys remain incomplete to this day. The island still contains pockets of forest that no naturalist has thoroughly cataloged. And throughout the late 19th and 20th centuries, the verdict of 1681 has been quietly, persistently challenged by people who claim to have seen something they should not have seen. Reports from rural Mauritian villagers describe a large, ground-dwelling bird in the forested interior. Some accounts come from hunters, some come from forestry workers. A cluster of unconfirmed sightings continued into the 1990s, described by witnesses who had no obvious motive to fabricate and, in several cases, no detailed knowledge of what a dodo was supposed to look like. The descriptions matched anyway. Stocky body, hooked beak, a bird that did not fly and did not flee. None of these sightings has produced a specimen. No photograph has survived scientific scrutiny. The official position remains unchanged. Raphis cucullatus has been extinct for 3.5 centuries, and the reports are misidentifications of feral chickens, escaped poultry, or imagination working on shadow. What makes the dodo case particularly unsettling is the assumption it forces us to confront. The dodo's extinction has always been treated as the cleanest, most documented disappearance in the historical record. A small island, a short timeline, a handful of European witnesses. We are certain about the dodo in a way we are certain about almost no other vanished species. And yet, the island where it lived still contains terrain that no scientific survey has fully penetrated, and the people who live closest to that terrain continue, generation after generation, to describe encounters that the textbooks say are impossible. The implications extend further than one bird. If the dodo's extinction, the most famous, most studied, most universally accepted extinction in modern history, can be quietly questioned by witnesses on the very island where the verdict was rendered, then the certainty we apply to other vanished species rests on thinner ground than we admit. Somewhere in the highland forests of Mauritius, the question continues to walk on short legs through undergrowth no one has mapped, calling a 2-note call that the textbooks say no living throat can still produce. Number 8. Steller's sea cow. In 1741, on the bleak shores of the Commander Islands in the Bering Sea, the Prussian naturalist Georg Wilhelm Steller stepped off the wreck of a ruined expedition and into history. He was stranded. The ship he had sailed on under the command of Vitus Bering had foundered in the icy waters off what is now Bering Island, and Bering himself would die there within weeks. But while the survivors scraped together driftwood shelters and gnawed on sea otter meat to stay alive, Steller did something extraordinary. He cataloged, he observed, and in the kelp-thick shallows of that frozen archipelago, he found an animal that science had never seen. Hydrodamylus gigas, a sirenian, a massive cold-water cousin of the manatee, grown to dimensions that defied the warm-water lineage it had descended from. Steller measured specimens up to 30 feet long. He estimated their weight at 10 tons. He described skin so thick and gnarled it resembled the bark of an ancient oak, dark brown and fissured, hanging in folds across a body that moved with the slow grace of something that had no predators worth fearing. The animals had no teeth. They grazed on kelp with horned plates inside their mouths, drifting in family groups through the shallow coastal waters, indifferent to the shipwrecked men watching from shore. By 1768, they were gone. 27 years. That is the entire interval between scientific discovery and total extinction. A species that had likely existed for millions of years, that had survived the closing of the Bering Land Bridge and the retreat of Pleistocene ice sheets, was annihilated in less time than it takes a human being to reach middle age. Russian fur traders followed Steller's published accounts to the Commander Islands and harpooned the sea cows for their meat, which kept on long voyages, and their thick blubber, which burned clean in lamps. The animals could not dive. They could not flee. They floated at the surface and were killed in place. The historical record closes the case in 1768 with the last documented kill on Bering Island. But the historical record may be wrong. In 1962, a Soviet whaling crew operating in the Bering Sea reported an encounter that has never been satisfactorily explained. The crew described a group of 6 large animals grazing in shallow coastal water off the Kamchatka Peninsula. The descriptions matched no known cetacean. No baleen whale grazes in kelp beds. No orca rests motionless at the surface in a slow-moving pod. The witnesses were experienced mariners who had spent their working lives identifying marine mammals at distance. What they reported was an animal between 20 and 25 feet long, dark-skinned, broad-bodied, browsing in the shallows exactly as Steller had described 2 centuries earlier. The report was filed, it was archived, and then it was joined by others. Throughout the latter half of the 20th century, a thin but persistent thread of sightings emerged from the most remote stretches of Russian and Alaskan coastline. Indigenous communities along the Bering Sea spoke of large, gentle animals that surfaced in protected coves. Fishermen reported carcasses they could not identify. None of the sightings produced a body. None produced photographs that satisfied skeptics. But the geographic consistency was striking. The reports clustered exactly where a relic population might survive. In cold, kelp-rich shallows along uninhabited coastline, thousands of kilometers from any meaningful human presence. The Commander Islands themselves remain among the least visited landscapes on Earth. The coastline of Kamchatka stretches for thousands of kilometers with virtually no permanent settlement. The northern Aleutians are weather-locked for much of the year. The conditions that allowed Steller's sea cow to be discovered late and exterminated quickly are the same conditions that would allow a small surviving population to remain invisible to science indefinitely. The animal that took 27 years to erase may have taken longer than anyone recorded to finish dying. And somewhere in the cold, green shallows of the North Pacific, the question of whether it finished at all has never been formally closed. Number 7. Haast's eagle. In 1871, geologist Julius von Haast examined a collection of enormous bird bones recovered from a swamp on New Zealand's South Island and realized he was holding the remains of a raptor unlike anything alive on Earth. The talons were the size of tiger claws. The leg bones were thicker than those of any modern eagle. When the full skeleton was reconstructed, the implication was inescapable. New Zealand had once been ruled from the sky by the largest eagle that ever existed. Hieratus morae, named in honor of the colonial collector George Moore, possessed a wingspan reaching up to 10 feet and a body weight approaching 33 pounds. By comparison, the modern golden eagle, considered formidable enough to take down young deer, weighs less than half as much. Haast's eagle was a flying predator built on the scale of a small leopard. Its talons could puncture bone. Its grip strength is estimated to have exceeded that of any living raptor by a significant margin. Its skull was reinforced to absorb the impact of strikes delivered from diving speeds that would have approached 50 miles per hour. It needed every ounce of that engineering. The South Island's primary herbivore was the moa, a flightless ratite that could stand 12 feet tall and weigh over 500 pounds. Haast's eagle hunted them. Fossil evidence from cave deposits shows moa pelvic bones punctured by talon strikes, consistent with the eagle's grip span. The bird descended from canopy height, struck the moa in the pelvis or skull with the velocity of a falling rock, and rode the carcass to the ground. For tens of thousands of years, this was the apex predation event of the New Zealand ecosystem. A bird killing a creature 6 times its own weight. Then the Maori arrived. Sometime in the late 13th century, Polynesian settlers reached the South Island and began hunting the moa with devastating efficiency. Within roughly a century, the moa was gone. Around 1400 CE, the eagle that had evolved to hunt them followed. With its primary food source eliminated, Haast's eagle could not sustain its enormous metabolic demands. The largest raptor in Earth's history starved out of existence within a few human generations. But the Maori remembered it. Oral traditions across the South Island describe a massive bird called puakai, a predator powerful enough to snatch children and adults from open ground. For decades, European ethnographers dismissed these accounts as folklore. The dimensions described were too extreme. The behavior was too aggressive. No bird could possibly do what the puakai stories claimed. Then the bones came out of the swamps, and the dismissal collapsed. The Maori had not been inventing a myth. They had been remembering an animal. The eyewitness reports that fueled their legends had been delivered by people who had actually shared a landscape with a 10-foot winged raptor capable of killing a human being. This is where the question turns uncomfortable. The South Island of New Zealand contains some of the most difficult terrain in the temperate world. The Southern Alps rise to over 12,000 feet across a spine of glaciated valleys, beech forests, and alpine plateaus that remain among the least surveyed environments on the planet. Entire valleys go unvisited for years. The Fjordland region in the southwest is so dense and so vertical that biologists periodically rediscover species there that had been presumed extinct for over a century. The takahe, a flightless bird written off as gone in 1898, was found alive in a remote valley in 1948. A small breeding population of Haast's eagle persisting in those mountains would require almost no infrastructure. A few nesting pairs in high alpine cliffs. A diet shifted to introduce deer and feral goats, both abundant. The reddish-brown plumage and black and white tail would blend into beech canopy. The yellow eyes would only be seen by something already too close to escape. There is no confirmed sighting. There is only terrain we have not searched, and a legend the Maori never stopped telling. Number 6. The thylacine, the ghost that refuses to stop walking. On the night of September 7th, 1936, in a concrete enclosure at the Hobart Zoo on the southern edge of Tasmania, the last known thylacine died. The keeper had forgotten to let the animal back into its sheltered den. Overnight temperatures dropped. The creature, exposed to the cold, did not survive until morning. The species, Thylacinus cynocephalus, the Tasmanian tiger, the largest marsupial carnivore of the modern era, was officially extinct. A film reel taken weeks earlier shows the animal pacing its enclosure, yawning into the camera, its jaws opening to a width that seemed anatomically impossible. Then the reel ends. The species ends with it. That is the official record. The official record has a problem. Every year since 1936, in Tasmania and across the southeastern mainland of Australia, hundreds of credible sightings are reported. Not vague claims from disoriented tourists. Reports from forestry workers, park rangers, livestock farmers, off-duty police officers, and biologists. People who know the difference between a fox, a feral dog, a dingo, and something else. The descriptions are remarkably consistent across 9 decades and thousands of kilometers. A dog-shaped animal with a stiff, kangaroo-like tail held rigid behind it. Yellowish-brown fur. A row of dark stripes, between 13 and 19, running across the lower back and hindquarters. A strange coughing bark, unlike any canine vocalization in the Australian bush. Witnesses who have never seen archival footage of a thylacine describe archival footage of a thylacine. The thylacine was not a dog. It was a marsupial, a pouched predator that had evolved its canine shape through one of the most extreme cases of convergent evolution ever documented. Its jaws could open to nearly 90 degrees, a gape so extreme it appears almost mechanical in the surviving film. It hunted at dawn and dusk. It moved with a stiff, awkward gait that witnesses describe again and again in reports separated by decades and continents within the continent. People who have never met each other, who do not know each other's accounts, describe the same animal moving the same way. In 2017, researchers at James Cook University took the reports seriously enough to act. A team led by Professor Bill Lawrence announced the deployment of camera traps across the remote, far north of Queensland, on the Cape York Peninsula, more than 2,000 kilometers from Tasmania. The decision was driven by witness statements from 2 long-term residents whose descriptions of the animals they had encountered were judged credible enough to warrant scientific investigation. The traps went up. The scientific community held its breath. The cameras recorded everything that moved through those forests for months. The results were inconclusive. Inconclusive is not the same as negative. Since then, trail camera footage and dash cam recordings have continued to surface. Grainy, ambiguous, occasionally sharp enough to spark genuine debate in zoological journals. In 2021, footage shared by a Tasmanian family of what they believe to be a thylacine family group prompted formal analysis. Experts disagreed. They are still disagreeing. The Tasmanian government maintains the species is extinct. The Department of Primary Industries continues to log and review sightings reports. The contradiction is institutional. What makes the thylacine particularly disturbing is what it represents. This is not a creature lost in the deep prehistory of the planet. This is an animal that walked into the 20th century, was photographed, was filmed, was kept in zoos, was studied by veterinarians, and then was declared gone within living memory of people still alive today. If the thylacine survives, it has survived not by hiding in some inaccessible abyss or unmapped jungle, but by walking quietly through the same forests where loggers work and hikers camp and children ride bicycles to school. It has survived by being seen and disbelieved hundreds of times, every year, for nearly a century. The Tasmanian wilderness covers tens of thousands of square kilometers of temperate rainforest, much of it so dense that aerial surveys cannot penetrate the canopy. Somewhere beneath that canopy, possibly, an animal that the world has agreed to mourn continues to step across wet leaves on stiff hindquarters, opening its impossible jaws and waiting for the next witness no one will believe. Number 5. The giant ground sloth and the creature the Amazon refuses to forget. The thylacine vanishes in 1936, and the institutions argue about pixels and trail cameras and whether a striped silhouette in low light qualifies as proof. The pattern holds. Official extinction declared. Eyewitness testimony dismissed. Wilderness too vast to fully survey. But the thylacine disappeared less than a century ago. The next entry pushes the same problem 10,000 years deeper into the past, and the testimony comes not from amateur naturalists with smartphones, but from peoples whose ancestors may have actually hunted the animal in question. Megatherium, the giant ground sloth, lived across South America during the Pleistocene epoch. It went extinct approximately 10,000 years ago, vanishing alongside the rest of the Ice Age megafauna in one of the most thoroughly documented extinction events in the paleontological record. The fossils are abundant. The dating is precise. The cause, a combination of climate shift and human predation, is broadly accepted. By every metric science recognizes, Megatherium is gone. The animal it describes is difficult to hold in the mind. Reared on its hind legs, Megatherium stood up to 20 feet tall, a size comparable to a modern elephant balanced upright on a thick tail. Its forelimbs ended in claws that functioned as both weapons and tools, capable of stripping branches, disemboweling predators, or excavating burrows large enough for a human to walk into upright. Its body was bear-like, broad through the shoulders, covered in shaggy brown fur. It moved slowly. It vocalized in deep grunts that would have carried through forest canopy for kilometers. It was the largest land mammal in the Western Hemisphere, and then, in geological terms, it wasn't. But here's where the standard explanation falls apart. Across the Amazon basin, from the rainforests of Brazil to the foothills of the Andes, indigenous tribes describe a creature called the mapinguari. The accounts are not folklore in the dismissive sense. They are reported as encounters. Hunters describe an animal the size of an ox or larger, covered in matted reddish-brown fur, moving on 2 legs or 4. They describe claws that strip bark from trees and tear through palm trunks. They describe a stench so overwhelming that the creature's approach can be detected before it is seen. A smell that hunters compare to rotting meat mixed with something fouler. They describe a deep, guttural call that travels through the forest at night and silences every other animal within range. And they describe one detail that has unsettled every researcher who has taken the testimony seriously. The mapinguari, according to multiple independent accounts from tribes separated by hundreds of kilometers of jungle, cannot be killed by bullets. Hunters report firing directly into the animal at close range. The rounds strike. The animal does not fall. The conventional interpretation is that this is myth. The disturbing interpretation is anatomical. Megatherium fossils show dermal ossicles, small bony plates embedded within the skin, forming a kind of natural armor across the back and flanks. This feature is documented in related ground sloth species and is consistent with what paleontologists understand of giant sloth defensive biology. A creature with skin reinforced by embedded bone would, in fact, be remarkably resistant to small caliber firearms of the kind carried by Amazonian hunters. The detail that should mark the mapinguari as fantasy is the detail that aligns it most precisely with the extinct animal it cannot possibly be. The alignment extends further. The mapinguari is described as bipedal when alarmed, dropping to all fours when moving through dense vegetation. Megatherium's skeletal structure supports exactly this kind of facultative bipedalism. The mapinguari is described as a slow-moving herbivore that becomes dangerous only when threatened. Megatherium was a slow-moving herbivore whose massive claws were almost certainly defensive. The mapinguari is described as solitary, nocturnal, and territorial. Every aspect of its reported behavior maps onto what paleontologists have reconstructed about how the largest ground sloths likely lived. In the 1990s, ornithologist David Oren of the Goeldi Museum in Belém conducted formal interviews with indigenous hunters across the Brazilian Amazon and concluded that the consistency of the descriptions warranted scientific investigation. He mounted multiple expeditions. He recovered hair samples, footprint casts, alleged feces. The physical evidence was inconclusive. The testimony was not. What makes this entry particularly disturbing is the question it forces. The Amazon basin contains over 5.5 million square kilometers of forest, much of it never systematically surveyed. New large mammal species are still being described from its interior. Indigenous knowledge has repeatedly proven accurate when academic science finally caught up to it. The peoples who describe the Mapinguari are the descendants of populations who arrived in South America during the late Pleistocene, who would have encountered Megatherium in the final centuries before its extinction. Their oral traditions are not separated from the animal by 10,000 years of cultural distance. They may be separated by far less. The fossils say the ground sloth has been gone for 10 millennia. The forest, and the people who know the forest, say something else entirely. Number 4, the saber-toothed cat. The pattern that emerged with the giant ground sloth. Indigenous testimony aligning with paleontological reconstruction across continents and millennia does not stop with herbivores. It extends, more disturbingly, to the apex predators that hunted them. Smilodon was the dominant carnivore of the Americas during the Pleistocene epoch. It went extinct approximately 10,000 years ago, vanishing alongside the mammoths, the mastodons, the ground sloths, and the dire wolves in the same wave of megafaunal collapse that ended the Ice Age world. Its skeletal remains have been recovered from tar pits, cave systems, and frozen sediment across 2 continents. Its anatomy is well understood. The reconstruction is precise. Smilodon was not built like a modern big cat. It was shorter, denser, more muscular, closer in proportion to a bulky bobcat amplified to terrifying scale. Its shoulders were thick. Its forelimbs were powerful enough to wrestle prey 3 times its weight to the ground. Its tail was stubby, almost vestigial, nothing like the long balancing tail of a lion or a tiger. Its fur, based on related species and habitat reconstruction, was likely tawny or spotted, suited to ambush in scrubland and forest fringe. And its mouth contained the feature that defines it in every illustration ever drawn: curved canine teeth up to 11 inches long, capable of puncturing the throat of a bison. To deploy those teeth, Smilodon could open its jaws to approximately 120 degrees. A modern lion manages roughly 65. The gape was not a stylistic flourish. It was a functional necessity. The cat had to clear the canines, past the prey's body before driving them down. The image that emerges from the fossil record is not a lion with longer teeth. It is something fundamentally different. A stalking, ambush-built apex predator whose mouth opened wider than any cat alive today. That should be the end of the description. The animal is extinct. The bones are cataloged. The story closes 10,000 years ago. But here's where the geography becomes impossible to ignore. In the remote jungles of South America, across the Amazon basin, and into the swamp forests of the Orinoco, indigenous communities describe an animal they call the water lion. The descriptions are consistent across tribes that have no contact with one another. A muscular cat, larger and bulkier than a jaguar, with short tail, powerful forelimbs, and oversized fangs visible even when the mouth is closed. It is said to drag prey into rivers. It is said to be solitary, silent, and unafraid of humans. The descriptions match Smilodon's anatomy with uncomfortable precision. The pattern would be easier to dismiss if it were confined to one continent. It is not. In the mountains of Central Africa, in the highland forests of Tanzania and the Congo borderlands, witnesses describe a creature called the mungwa. The reports go back generations and have been documented by colonial-era hunters, missionaries, and modern researchers. The mungwa is described as a cat the size of a donkey, built thick and low to the ground, with tawny gray fur marked by faint spots, a stubbed tail, and fangs that protrude visibly below the lower jaw. It is said to kill silently and leave tracks larger than any leopard or lion known to the region. The descriptions match Smilodon's anatomy with uncomfortable precision. 2 continents. 2 unconnected oral traditions. 2 predator descriptions that align with the same extinct animal. Neither community had access to paleontological reconstructions. Neither was working from museum dioramas or illustrated children's books. The descriptions exist in languages and cultures that developed independently of Western science, and they converge on the same anatomical profile: the bulk, the short tail, the tawny coat, the exposed fangs, the impossible gape. What makes the saber-toothed cat particularly disturbing is what its persistence would imply. The ground sloth could plausibly survive in the Amazon as a slow, hidden herbivore. A predator the size of Smilodon would need territory, prey base, and breeding population. It would need to remain unseen by satellite, undetected by camera traps, unrecorded by every scientific expedition that has crossed those regions. And yet, the witnesses keep describing it. The pygmy hunters in the Congo highlands, the river communities along Amazon tributaries. The descriptions persist across centuries, with details that match a creature the textbooks say died 10,000 years ago. If the water lion and the mungwa are real, then Smilodon did not vanish at the end of the Ice Age. It simply moved deeper into the places we still have not gone. The fossil record marks an ending. The witnesses on 2 continents describe something that never ended at all. Number 3, the Plesiosaur, the reptile that should have died with the dinosaurs. In 1977, the Japanese fishing trawler Zuyo Maru was working the waters off the coast of New Zealand when its nets snagged on something heavy approximately 300 meters below the surface. When the crew winched the catch to the deck, they found themselves looking at a decomposing carcass, roughly 10 meters long, with a small head, an impossibly long neck, a broad torso, and 4 large flippers. The smell was so overwhelming that the captain, Akira Tanaka, made the decision to dump the carcass back into the sea rather than risk contaminating his fish hold. Before it went over the side, crew member Michihiko Yano photographed it, took measurements, and cut several samples of fibrous tissue from one of the flippers. The photographs reached Tokyo within weeks. Japanese paleontologists examined the images and the proportions of the carcass, and concluded that what the Zuyo Maru had pulled from the deep matched the anatomy of one creature in the fossil record: a plesiosaur. The Japanese government issued a commemorative postage stamp depicting the find. Marine biologists, who later analyzed the tissue samples, argued the fibers were consistent with a decomposing basking shark, whose carcasses can rot into pseudo-plesiosaur shapes as the jaw and gills fall away. The case was officially closed. The carcass that might have rewritten paleontology was rotting on the seafloor of the South Pacific, beyond any possibility of recovery. The plesiosaur lived from the late Triassic through the late Cretaceous. It vanished from the fossil record approximately 66 million years ago, alongside the non-avian dinosaurs, in the mass extinction event triggered by the Chicxulub impact. Some species grew to over 50 feet in length, propelling themselves through Mesozoic seas on 4 powerful flippers, their serpentine necks extending forward to snatch fish from schools that had no defense against an ambush predator that could strike from below and from far away at the same time. They were among the most successful marine reptiles in Earth's history, occupying ocean ecosystems for over 130 million years. Then, in the geological equivalent of an afternoon, they were gone. Or so the fossil record insists. But here's where the conventional timeline begins to fracture against the testimony of witnesses across 3 continents. The plesiosaur's anatomical signature, that small head, that long swan-like neck breaking the surface, that dark body moving with deliberate purpose beneath the waterline, appears with uncanny consistency in reports from bodies of water separated by thousands of kilometers of land. At Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands, Nessie has been described in plesiosaur terms since the first modern sighting in 1933. At Lake Champlain on the border of Vermont and New York, Champ matches the same anatomical profile, with hundreds of recorded sightings dating to the 19th century. In Lake Ikeda on the Japanese island of Kyushu, Issy is described by local fishermen in language that could be transcribed directly from a paleontology textbook. The geographic distribution is what makes the pattern unsettling. These are not communities sharing folklore across borders. Highland Scotland, the American Northeast, and southern Japan have no shared mythological tradition that would explain why the witnesses describe the same animal. Skeptics dismiss the sightings as misidentified otters, logs, surface wave patterns, or wishful thinking. The skepticism is rational. The replication of detail across cultures that have never communicated about the subject is harder to dismiss. What makes the plesiosaur particularly difficult to write off is the geography of where it could theoretically persist. The deep ocean remains overwhelmingly unmapped. Freshwater lakes that connect to ancient marine systems through subterranean channels exist in glaciated regions across the northern hemisphere. Loch Ness alone is over 230 meters deep and contains more freshwater than every lake in England and Wales combined. A breeding population of large marine reptiles hiding in environments humans have barely surveyed is impossible. But the same word applied to the coelacanth, a fish. Believed extinct for 66 million years until a fisherman pulled one out of the Indian Ocean in 1938. The coelacanth and the plesiosaur disappear from the fossil record at the same boundary. One of them came back. The Zuyo-Maru carcass is gone. The photographs remain. The tissue samples, analyzed and reanalyzed, continue to generate disagreement among biologists who cannot quite agree on what the fibers prove. And in 3 lakes on 3 continents, witnesses continue to describe the same dark body, breaking the same surface, the same long neck rising from the same cold water, the same animal that the fossil record insists has been extinct for longer than mammals have existed in their current form. The plesiosaur officially died 66 million years ago. Something keeps appearing in the photographs. Number 2, the woolly mammoth, the giant that may not have finished dying. In 1993, paleontologist Sergei Vartanyan published findings in Nature that quietly rewrote the timeline of the Ice Age. Working on Wrangel Island, a remote chunk of frozen rock in the Arctic Ocean north of Siberia, Vartanyan had been radiocarbon dating mammoth remains pulled from the permafrost. The dates came back wrong, not Pleistocene wrong, catastrophically, recently wrong. A population of woolly mammoths had been alive on Wrangel Island as recently as 1650 BCE. That date is not a typo. While the pyramids of Giza stood completed on the Egyptian sand, while Mesopotamian scribes pressed cuneiform into clay tablets, while the Minoans painted frescoes on the walls of Knossos, woolly mammoths were still walking the earth. Mammuthus primigenius had roamed the Ice Age tundras of Europe, Asia, and North America for hundreds of thousands of years. The continental populations vanished approximately 4,000 years ago, victims of warming climates and human spears. But the Wrangel Island holdouts, isolated by rising seas, persisted into the historical era. They were not a relic of deep prehistory. They were contemporaries of civilization. The numbers describe an animal built for a world that no longer exists. Adult bulls stood 9 to 11 feet at the shoulder. Their bodies were covered in a double coat of thick reddish-brown, shaggy hair, an outer layer of guard hairs reaching nearly a meter in length over a dense woolen undercoat. Their curved tusks grew up to 15 feet long, spiraling outward from the skull in shapes that no modern elephant approaches. A full-grown mammoth weighed 6 tons and could trumpet loud enough to carry across frozen plains for kilometers. They were not subtle animals. They were the largest land mammals of their epoch, and they died so recently that their bodies have not finished decomposing. But here's where the standard narrative of extinction begins to feel unstable. Siberian permafrost is the most reliable preservation medium on Earth. Frozen specimens are routinely uncovered from the thawing tundra with intact fur, intact blood, intact muscle tissue, intact stomach contents, revealing the last meal the animal ate. In 2013, researchers extracted liquid blood from a mammoth carcass on Maly-Lyakovsky Island. Liquid blood from an animal supposedly extinct for millennia. The preservation is so complete that geneticists have sequenced the full mammoth genome. The flesh is so fresh that sled dogs will eat it, and the Siberian wilderness in which these bodies surface is vast beyond rational comprehension. Russia's far north encompasses over 13 million square kilometers of taiga, tundra, and frozen wetland. Significant regions of central and eastern Siberia have never been surveyed on foot by anyone in the scientific record. Satellite imagery shows endless forest, endless bog, endless white. The human population density across enormous tracts approaches zero. If a small herd of large mammals wished to remain hidden in that geography, the geography would oblige them. The indigenous peoples of Siberia have stories. The Yakuts, the Chukchi, the Evenki, the Khanty, all of them describe massive hairy beasts that move beneath the earth, surfacing only in remote forests and frozen valleys. Their term for the animal is consistent across tribes that historically had little contact with one another. The creatures are said to burrow through the permafrost, to live underground, to die when exposed to sunlight. Western anthropologists have long treated these accounts as mythological rationalizations for the mammoth carcasses, the tribes regularly encountered in eroding riverbanks, a folk explanation for an inexplicable corpse. But here's where the rationalization becomes uncomfortable. The stories describe behavior, not just anatomy. They describe movement, vocalization, seasonal patterns. They describe encounters with living animals, not the discovery of dead ones. The Russian explorer Yermak's expeditions reported similar accounts in the 16th century. 20th century surveyors in the Taimyr Peninsula recorded the same descriptions from witnesses who claimed first-hand sightings. None of these reports has ever been substantiated. None has ever been definitively refuted either. What makes the woolly mammoth particularly haunting is the temporal proximity of its disappearance. This is not a creature lost to deep time. This is a creature whose blood was still liquid yesterday, whose contemporaries on Wrangel Island shared the planet with literate human civilizations, whose habitat remains the least surveyed terrestrial environment on Earth. The mammoth did not vanish into geological abstraction. It receded into a wilderness so large that the question of whether the recession was total may never be answerable. Somewhere beneath the permafrost, the bodies are still thawing. The hair is still red. The tusks still curve toward a sky that has not finished forgetting them. Number 1. Mokolmbembe, the dinosaur that refused to die. Deep in the Likuwala swamp region of the Republic of the Congo, an area of flooded forest and black water covering roughly 55,000 square kilometers, local villagers describe an animal that should not exist. They call it Mokolmbembe, the one who stops the flow of rivers. They describe it the same way their grandparents described it, and their grandparents before them. Elephant-sized, smooth grayish-brown skin, a long, flexible neck rising from a barrel body, a tail like a thick snake dragged behind it, and footprints, massive three-toed impressions pressed into the mud of riverbanks where no known African animal walks. The problem is simple. The animal they are describing is a sauropod, and sauropods went extinct 66 million years ago. Beginning in the early 1980s, a series of Western expeditions entered the Likuwala Basin to investigate. American biologist Roy McCall led 2 expeditions in 1980 and 1981. Engineer Herman Regusters mounted his own search in the same period. Japanese teams, British teams, and independent cryptozoologists followed throughout the 1980s and 1990s. They returned with audio recordings of unidentified vocalizations, plaster casts of large unexplained footprints, photographs of disturbed vegetation along waterways, and consistent eyewitness testimony from villagers who had no apparent reason to coordinate their stories across hundreds of kilometers of roadless jungle. None of them returned with a body. None of them returned with a confirmed photograph. The animal, if it exists, has refused to be found. But here's where the story becomes genuinely impossible. In the late 20th century, researchers including McCall and his colleagues conducted a now famous test. They showed picture books containing illustrations of various animals to pygmy populations deep in the Likuala region, communities with minimal contact with the outside world and no exposure to Western dinosaur imagery. The villagers correctly identified elephants, hippos, gorillas, and crocodiles. When they reached the page depicting a sauropod, they reacted with recognition. They named it. They described its behavior. They warned the researchers about it. The identification was consistent across separate communities that had never communicated with each other and had never seen a dinosaur book in their lives. They were not guessing. They were identifying a neighbor. The implications fracture in several directions at once. Either multiple isolated pygmy communities independently invented the same detailed mythology about a long-necked aquatic giant, complete with anatomical accuracy that matches paleontological reconstructions made by scientists working from fossils thousands of kilometers away, or they were describing something they had actually seen. The geology offers no comfort. The Congo Basin's swamp ecosystem is one of the most stable habitats on the planet. While ice ages reshaped Europe and deserts swallowed the Sahara, the Likuala swamps remained essentially unchanged for tens of millions of years. The temperature stayed constant. The water levels stayed constant. The vegetation profile, the oxygen levels, the predator-prey relationships remained within a narrow band that could theoretically have sheltered a relict population through extinction events that erased the rest of their kind. There is no scientific law that prevents a sauropod from existing in the Likuala. There is only the overwhelming improbability that one does. What makes Mokele Mbembe the most disturbing entry on this list is not the possibility that it exists. It is what its existence would mean. The Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event 66 million years ago is one of the foundational pillars of modern biology. It defines the boundary between two geological eras. It explains the rise of mammals, the evolution of primates, the eventual emergence of humanity. If a single breeding population of sauropods survived in a Congolese swamp, the entire framework of post-Cretaceous evolution would require recalibration. The asteroid would still have struck. The ash would still have darkened the sky. But the line between the age of reptiles and the age of mammals, the line we have drawn through deep time as absolute, would turn out to be permeable. Something stepped across it. Something is still standing on the other side. The Likuala swamps remain among the least surveyed ecosystems on Earth. Satellite imagery cannot penetrate the canopy. Ground expeditions move at less than 2 kilometers per day through water that hides everything beneath its black surface. The Congolese government has declared portions of the region protected wilderness, but enforcement is minimal and exploration is rare. Whatever lives there continues to live there, witnessed by villagers who have no incentive to lie and no exposure to the imagery their descriptions match. Somewhere in the flooded forest tonight, water is moving against a current that has nothing to do with the wind. A three-toed impression is filling slowly with black water along a bank no scientist has ever mapped. The pygmies who live there are not surprised. They have always known what shares the swamp with them. They have been telling us for over a century, and we have not yet decided whether to believe them. The age of dinosaurs may not have ended. It may have only retreated. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.